Hello everybody, I'm Sharon Friel and I want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on various lands all over Australia. We're here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and colleagues who are joining us online. So welcome to the Saving the World webinar series. It comes to you from the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse, which is an initiative we set up through the ARC Laureate Fellowship on Governance for Planetary Health Equity, based here in the School of Regulation and Global Governance. I'm joined by my colleague over on the far left here, so Dr. Nick Frank, who's one of the Laureate Research Fellows. And each month we're joined by a fantastic guest where we're discussing the different aspects of the global consumptogenic system, its structural origins, and what this means for this intersecting challenge of climate change, inequality, and health. And today I'm delighted we're joined by our marvellous RegNet colleague, Associate Professor Christian Downie. And as you see on the screen, Christian's speaking about following the money. Christian does beautiful work looking at energy governance and really unpacking kind of the range of activities that the different actors in that governance system, what they're up to. And of course, for us in the Hothouse, that's really important because, of course, the energy system is a key part of the global consumptogenic system that really matters for planetary health equity. So we keep telling Christian he's a health person. He doesn't believe it, but he really is. But really, with no further ado, Christian, thanks a million for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks so much for the invitation to be part of this new Saving the World webinar series. And let me just also echo an acknowledgement to country that I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging from the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra. So I guess for more than a decade now, I've been writing, thinking about the politics of climate change, working in think tanks, a bit of time in government, and most recently in academia. And much of my recent work has focused on thinking about how do we advance climate politics, particularly over the political opposition we see from incumbent industries that often mobilise campaigns and other activities to obstruct climate action in this country and all around the world. And obviously that's probably a particularly important issue right now, especially in the context of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which came out this week, just showing how close the world is to the brink of disaster. We're right on the cusp of overreaching that 1.5 degree target that countries agreed to in Paris a few years ago. And of course, the only way to stop the growing severity and frequency of droughts, floods, fires that we're seeing in this country is to bring down emissions as quickly as possible. But to do that, we need, of course, political action. So it's in that context today that I want to talk about a paper that I've recently published with a colleague, Professor Friel at Brown University, which looks at the role of trade associations in the United States. So let me say a little bit about some of the literature around that. As I'm sure everyone knows, there's growing empirical evidence that, particularly in the United States, right, that the political activities of firms across a whole range of industries have engaged in activities to obstruct climate policy, both federally and at the state level. In fact, fossil fuel companies around the world have engaged in multi-billion-dollar campaigns since the early 1990s to deny the science of climate change. They funded television campaigns, online campaigns, social media campaigns, all to question science and all to cast doubt about how quickly we should act to reduce emissions. Now, we know a lot about the role of individual firms. For example, there's a lot of excellent work that's being done on some of the big oil and gas majors like ExxonMobil and how much they knew about the science of climate change all the way back to the 1970s. But much less work has been done on the role of trade associations. That is, on these types of industry groups that firms use to coordinate their activities. So sometimes you hear the phrase industry lobby group. In Australia, most of you will be familiar with groups such as the Minerals Council of Australia, which was in the papers today, I noticed, running a campaign in the New South Wales election. Other groups like APIA, which represents upstream oil producers in this country. So we know a lot about the firms, the role of firms, but much less about these kind of overarching bodies. The second thing is that in a lot of the scholarly work, particularly in political science, a lot of the work that's being done on the politics of business has been focused on lobbying and political contributions. So huge amounts of literature on, how much do firms give to political parties, to political candidates, what role do lobbyists play in the halls of Congress, and so on. Much less work has been done on other forms of political spending, something I want to touch on today, but especially on trade associations in the domain of climate change. So it's in that context that we set out to basically do an exploratory study looking at the role of trade associations, working on climate issues in the US. Now, as I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, overall, one of the headline takeaways from this paper is that trade associations in the US for over a decade spent $3.4 billion US just on politics. And we argue in the paper that if you don't take account of the role of these particular business actors, you're overlooking one of the key opponents of climate action in the US and arguably in many other jurisdictions as well. So I want to do a couple of things, or three things today. The first is to say a little bit about, okay, well, who are these trade associations? What's the population of groups working on climate change? You can see there on the slide, there's some of the big ones in the US, the American Petroleum Institute, the Coal Council, Edison Electric, which represents utilities in the US, and then some of the peak associations like the US Chamber of Commerce. And we obviously have similar groups here like the Australian Chamber of Commerce. That's the first thing I want to do. The second is to look at their political activities. What are they doing and where are they spending their money when you follow the money? And the third thing you'll see is that there's quite an interesting distribution in the types of activities they engage in. And so we sought to understand why that is. Why are they spending more on some activities rather than others? So that was the aim of this work, or the aims of this work. Let me say a little bit about the methods and data, because as the title suggested for today, really what we did is set out to do was follow the money. So we firstly needed to identify who are these trade associations. We looked at a number of sources, such as which trade associations were appearing before the US Senate and different congressional committees on climate issues. We looked at a listing of all trade associations doing similar work. And basically, we came up with a list of 87 trade associations that work on climate change in the US across 9 sectors of the US economy. This is between 2008 and 2018. And then to analyze this data, we looked at the revenue and spending data for trade associations. And one of the nice things in the US is that you can look at their tax filings, because they're not-for-profit organizations under the IRS, under the Internal Revenue Code. They have to report on how much revenue, their revenue, but they also have to report on their expenditures. And so when you go through these 990 forms, these paper forms that they fill out and submit, you can answer some of these questions. Also, very helpfully, you can disaggregate by the type of political activity. And then, of course, the quantitative data doesn't really help to answer the really interesting question of why. And so over the last 18 months or so, we conducted 23 semi-structured interviews. The main people we targeted was presidents and vice presidents of government affairs or public affairs in these associations. Now, the reason we wanted to speak to these people are these the ones that are typically making the decision about political strategy, where to spend money. We also did some supplementary interviews with some of the member firms, that is the firms like Exxon, whoever it happens to be, that pay the dues of these associations, and with some of the public relations firms and lobbying firms that are contracted by trade associations to do some of this work. Okay, so that's a little bit of the context, the background, and the data. So who are they and what's their revenues? You can see here on this slide represents total revenue of $25.6 billion. So these 87 trade associations had $25.6 billion in revenue over the decade to 2018. And on this slide, you can see that revenue is displayed by sector. So most sectors, like the top left-hand box there, oil and gas in purple, most sectors have, say, one big association, like the American Petroleum Institute, and then they have several smaller associations that represent subsections of the industry. So, for example, the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers Association also represents oil and gas, but they also represent downstream. They include petrochemical firms like Dow Chemical, for example. So you can see quite clearly on this slide, if you look at that purple box, right, oil and gas has some of the largest revenues, almost 4.6 billion. Peak association, so that is the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, that is those associations that tend to represent firms right across the economy. They also had revenues in excess of $4 billion. One of our other motivations in this paper was to think about, who is typically opposed to climate action and who is generally supportive. Now, we can draw on existing studies in the climate politics literature to identify the types of industries that tend to be opposed. And that is oil and gas, that is utilities, transport, rail and steel. If you add up the revenues from those sectors, you're looking at $14.3 billion. If you cast your eye all the way down to that dark blue box in the bottom right-hand corner, that's the renewable sector. That is solar, wind, hydro. They're the industries that typically are more supportive of climate policy. So you've got revenue from those opposed sitting at 14.3 billion versus, say, 580 million for those industries that generally come out in support. I'd also argue, and we do in the paper, is that's probably conservative. So light blue there is agriculture. There's plenty of work showing that trade associations like the American Farm Bureau have also been opponents of climate change. So I'd say some of these estimates are quite conservative. Of course, agriculture is very emissions intensive too. So it's no surprise that some of the trade associations representing agriculture have also been opponents. I think the takeaway message here, right, is that there's a resources mismatch. Those industries that typically oppose climate change are completely outgunning those in the clean energy or renewable energy sectors. So that's a little bit about the revenue. So I want to look now at their spending to see whether we see this same mismatch in what they're spending. Overall spending was $3.4 billion. So that was about 13% of this revenue over a decade. As you can see here, this is the industries that typically opposed climate change. This is their spending on all political activities. Oil and gas there in purple, stands out as far the largest, $1.3 billion they spent over a decade. I should say this is just trade associations, right? This isn't their firms, which we also know are spending, in fact, more money. But the trade associations representing oil and gas spent $1.3 billion. The next largest there is in orange, which is the peak trade associations. They spent about $637 million. Now, if you can compare that, this is those industries without the peak associations, you're still looking at $2 billion in spending there. If you compare that to the renewable energy sector, you can just see the mismatch, right? You've got well over $2 billion being spent on politics from those typically opposed versus a tiny fraction, 74.5 million being spent over a decade by solar, wind, hydro, and a handful of others like geothermal. So again, a huge mismatch. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why we've seen so many ambitious climate policies in the US end up in the dustbin. Okay, so what do they spend their money on? Well, typically in political science, as I said, we tend to focus on lobbying and political contributions. But we know from works in business and management and sociology and other fields that business do a lot more than just that. And often their overarching political aims, which might be to stall federal climate policy across a range of sectors, means that they have a raft of different activities that are sequenced and designed across different jurisdictions in a quite sophisticated way to achieve their overarching aims. As I mentioned in the introduction, what the data allows us to do is to disaggregate the types of activities. So the first thing, as you can see here, is that the largest amount of spending was on advertising and promotion. Well over $2 billion, 64% of the total money being spent, in our study anyway, went to advertising and promotion or PR campaigns. So they spent money on TV campaigns, social media campaigns, large media buys, so they're running ads, on your television in California and so forth. They also, of course, spent a lot of money on lobbying. 21% of the total there, or about $730 million, was going into lobbying. So that is contracting typically firms, or they have in-house lobbyists to go and walk the halls of Congress to meet with senators and others to remind them of their particular interest. This one I want to get to in a moment as well, because it's quite interesting, grants. So this is 12% of the total, just under $400 million of spending. When we looked at this, they're giving grants to basically everyone, to local community groups, museums, charitable foundations, think tanks, universities, political associations. Basically, you name it, they're giving grants to it. Some of these grants are as small as 5 or 10,000 US. Some of them are well up to $500,000 or more. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then the final one is political contributions. Still a huge amount of money, right? $105 million, more or less, but only 3% of the total. So you can see that if you're just focusing on political contributions and lobbying, you're missing out on a huge chunk of the pie there of the other activities that these industry groups engage in. And so to give you an example of some of the stuff that falls under advertising and promotion, as I said, some of it is large media buys, but here's some recent examples. So this stuff's been going on for decades. It's not new. And there's a report here on the left-hand side in the New York Times in January, which gave an example of the the New York Propane Gas Association, a trade association in New York, which spent just under $1 million flooding social media with misleading information about heat pumps. And what they were trying to do is to derail attempts in New York State to electrify homes and buildings. Obviously, the propane industry and the wider gas industry is pretty keen to have everyone still using gas stoves and doesn't want homes electrified. So the picture here is of a guy that apparently is a bit of a reality star on do-it-yourself TV, and they paid him to on TV and elsewhere to talk up the use of propane and gas stoves and other things in the home to try and derail attempts at electrification in New York. So yeah, these things are still going on. AFPM, the American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers, there on their Twitter page is talking about some of the campaigns they're running. They spent millions on PR in recent years promoting the rollback of federal fuel efficiency standards. In other words, as you can imagine, oil refiners and others, they don't want cars to be not running on oil, right? They want to slow down the transition to electric vehicles. It's in their commercial interest to do so. And so they've spent millions on public relations campaigns to do just that. And as I said, this has been going on for decades. That bottom ad there is one that the American Petroleum Institute ran, I think, including at the Super Bowl a few years back, which is an ad about the power of oil and how our whole society survives because of oil. Now you can click on that in your own time. So I think it's important to look at these organisations because of how much they're spending, because what they do, but also qualitative work has shown that these organisations are often the command centre for coalitions that are built to try and kill off particular policies. We saw that during President Obama's attempts both at emissions trading in his first term and at regulation in his second term, the Clean Power Plan. So these associations often basically act as the convener, bringing together different firms and different industries to run campaigns. And I think then the other thing that this work shows is that it really challenges those prevailing assumptions in much of the academic literature that it's all about political contributions and lobbying, because clearly it's not. Okay, so when we were tallying up the data, putting some of these graphs together, it was, obviously quite interesting. It was a bit of a surprise, perhaps, how much was going into PR. But then the obvious question is why, right? Why are we seeing this distribution of political spending? Now, this matters, as I said, because of the role that these associations play in prioritising issues and strategies for particular industries. But it also matters to the overarching political strategy. So we went through the literature, and there's a range of possible explanations for this. We focused on 4: the role and functions of trade associations, their characteristics of the industry, the issue, and effectiveness. So, for example, are we seeing this distribution of spending because trade associations have a unique role that firms don't have? Or is it because, for example, when an issue is particularly salient, you might use one strategy over another? So, as I said, over the last 18 months, we did about 23 interviews, spent a little bit of time in DC talking to some of these lobbyists, talking to some of the firms that they contract to do this work. We didn't have empirical support for all of these, but the one that really, I think, helps to explain some of this distribution in spending is the role and functions of trade associations. I think one of the key reasons that you see industry groups spending a lot in this area is because they have a unique role of protecting the reputation, the public reputation of an industry. And also they do that with public, like pro campaigns, but they also do that by negative campaigns because firms don't want to be tarred with the brush of a particular campaign. Here's one quote from a Vice President of Government Affairs, and he's talking about here how members of associations, they don't want to be the name on the door for a campaign that might be controversial. They don't want to be the tip of the spear, in his words. And they want to be one step removed, right? They want to have almost like a level of deniability that their particular firm is not directly associated with this campaign. The other reason they do a lot of public relations, as other respondents mentioned, is because, doing this type of work is really just what the membership wants them to do. The membership, that is the firms, the different firms that finance these associations, they want these associations to be out there talking about how good oil and gas is, how central it is to society, or how important railroads are, or whatever the particular industry is. There wasn't as much support for number 2 and 3 there. When we spoke to folk about, to what extent is the type of industry that you work in or the type of issue driving the choice of political activity, not as much support for that. There was much more support for this idea of effectiveness, pretty simply being that you basically spend more money on things that you think are going to be more effective. And we saw this in some of the interviews. So trade associations with smaller budgets often said that, if they had to choose, they'd spend more money on lobbying and public relations because they thought it was more effective. We saw this in some of the quotes. That second one there is from one particular trade association who's talking about giving sponsorship. Now, sponsorship comes in the form of grants to the Western Governors Association. That is all the governors on the west coast of the US from, California and Oregon and so forth. And you can see that they said, well, look, we decided not to give any more grants because we couldn't really demonstrate the cost effectiveness of it. Having said that, it also, in other interviews, people pointed out, yeah, okay, well, maybe political contributions aren't as effective, but they are helpful, and they give you more face time with legislators. In other words, they help you to buy access. So yes, it was only 3% of the total, but of course, it's still $105 million over a decade. So it's no small amount of money either. I think the other thing here is that clearly these findings are very tentative. What we really need now is some more in-depth case studies looking at particular policy contests and exploring, why and how trade associations are allocating their funding to particular activities. But I might conclude there because I want to make sure we've got enough time for comments and questions. But I hope that this work really highlights the sum of trade associations' political activities on climate issues in the US, and really the important role that they can and do play as opponents of climate action. I think whether we're doing further research on trade associations in the climate domain or in other policy domains, I know a lot of you online probably have an interest in health. I think clearly there's a lot more work to be done, and these particular types of business actors merit a lot more scholarly and policy attention. If you're after more information, there's a book here from a couple of years ago, and the top bullet point there is the paper on which this presentation is based. So feel free to get in contact, ask questions, and happy to send through a copy of that if it's of interest. But otherwise, thanks everyone for tuning in and giving me a lunch break.
Lovely. Well, Christian, that was truly marvellous and really so relevant for planetary health equity. I might just note for anybody who's listening in online, there is going to be a launch of the Lancet series on the commercial determinants of health. So there's 3 papers that are coming out. Well, actually tonight, the embargo gets lifted tonight and there's a global launch next week, but it's so relevant to what you've just that sort of the playbook of strategies and tactics that Christian has spelled out. We see that replicated across so many different industries and domains. So please watch out for the launch of the Lancet series on the commercial determinants of health. The global launch is going to be next Tuesday, 11 p.m. Canberra time. And then for those in Victoria, we've got a launch down in Melbourne next Thursday. So next, just going to have a little bit of a conversation with Christian, just for a few minutes, really, just to pick up on some of the points that Christian has raised so beautifully, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion.
That's great. Thanks, Sharon. And thank you again, Christian. That was fantastic. I was wondering if you thought that political activity or spending increased as issue salience increased among either the general public or political elites.
Yeah, so that was one of our assumptions going forward, that the type of issue and the salience of the issue would be a big explanatory factor for why we saw the distribution of spending that we did. As I mentioned, the interview data didn't really bear that out, so we didn't find that. I don't think that's to say that it played no role, because there's plenty of other existing work which has spoken about how important that issue is. So, for example, there's a lot of work on what's known as quiet politics in the business space. And that's basically the assumption that business prefers to work on issues that are not high on the public agenda, that don't have high salience, because they can use their structural power, they can work behind closed doors to get things done. So you might expect when an issue has low salience or is not particularly visible, it's not on the front pages of newspapers, it's not in your social media feeds, that you might see more spending, say, on inside lobbying and less spending on public relations. Now, we didn't do a detailed quantitative analysis of that issue, but the tentative conclusions from the qualitative work suggest that that wasn't one of the driving factors of why we saw that distribution in spending.
That's really, really interesting. And it's kind of related to my second question, which is whether you could maybe speculate or provide some examples of the type of sequencing that trade associations employ. Do they tend to use grant funding followed by PR activities or vice versa? Are these activities complements to one another, or are they substitutes in some way?
Yeah, look, so this is where I'd love to write, because I think clearly they are sequenced. We know, just when you're in the room talking with some of these people, right, they've essentially got a playbook, they've got sophisticated, quite complicated playbooks for how they're going to address a particular issue. Is it a legislative issue? Is it a regulatory issue? In what domains do the firms they're representing are going to bear the cost? So do they need to run a federal campaign with branches at a subnational level? So they're thinking very much like a chessboard and what levers they can pull. Maybe they give grants to a particular local government. Maybe they spend money lobbying Congress at the same time. Maybe they run a public relations campaign in a particular swing state, which they think is going to have a lot of sway. So I think the short answer is yes, they're sequenced. How? I think it depends a lot on the contest at hand. I touched on in there that you might use, say, political contributions or grants as access to help you with access, right? So for example, a lot of these trade associations gave money to, like the Alzheimer's Foundation. And when I was doing these interviews, I asked, why are you giving $10,000 or $15,000 to the Alzheimer's Foundation? Now, in some cases, it may be purely benign, it might be philanthropic, but some respondents, pointed out that it helps you to buy access. How does it? Well, the Alzheimer's Foundation, for example, I'm not picking on that organization, most groups in the US, most charities, they have annual gala dinners, where they'll honor a particularly well-known member of the DC community. It might be the Senate Finance Chairman. So if you give a grant to the Alzheimer's Foundation for $10,000, that might buy you a seat at the table with the Senate Finance Chairman, and your Vice President can then go along, sit at that table, gently remind the Senator of some of the issues that are of concern to your member firms, and then, of course, help set up a meeting with one of their chief lobbyists on Monday or Tuesday next week. So it buys you that type of access. I think that's one way these grants are used. Another way, of course, is to improve, I think, the social license to operate. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. So, why are these groups giving, grants to sporting groups, scouts clubs, your local historical museum in a particular jurisdiction? Well, I think one reason, and this is still very much a guess, is that if you operate a particular power plant or an operation in those communities, it makes sense to give this type of money to ensure that you've got a good public reputation, and that you're seen in a good light by the community. In other words, that you've got a strong social license to operate. That also helps, of course, and this came out in a few interviews, that also helps when things go wrong, because a community is less likely to turn on you as quickly if you've been a big supporter of their community. So grants help with that. The other thing they help with is these groups can become allies, right? We saw this a little bit in the Four Corners. For those of you, changing policy domains, but there was a Four Corners a couple of weeks ago looking at how the hotel, the gambling, the poker machine lobby work. And the way that they enlisted members of RSL clubs and others to come out and campaign against poker reforms. You see the same thing here. You give grants to particular groups that you may be able to enlist as allies in future political campaigns, or at the very least, you hope they abstain and don't become opponents of yours going forward. So long-winded answer, heaps going on, and I think there's a lot of work to be done to think about what that playbook looks like.
Can't wait for that paper. I can see you kind of overlaying political activity with business operations already. But I don't want to monopolise the conversation. So I think we've got further questions.
Quite a few questions coming in. So maybe we'll go to some questions and then we can keep the conversation going.